Welcome to another episode of Progress, Potential, and Possibilities, discussions with fascinating people designing a better tomorrow for all of us. I'm your host, Ira Pastor.
Welcome, everybody, again to another episode of our show. Today, bringing another really awesome guest involved in creating a better tomorrow. Today, we have the honor of being joined on the show by Kevin Caldwell. Kevin is the Chief Executive Officer, co-founder, and president of Ossium Health. They are a commercial stage bioengineering company. They're leveraging really proprietary technologies in the area of organ donor bone marrow banking to develop interesting stem cell therapies for patients with various life-threatening hematologic conditions, as well as organ transplant rejection, as well as musculoskeletal defects. Kevin built Ossium from a very small startup into the clinical stage bioengineering company it is today, has led the company over the years in various negotiations, over 50 different business relationships, as well as 5 rounds of fundraising, as well as numerous partnerships, as well as a really recent one that they just sealed with BARDA in the area of radiological and nuclear emergency preparedness, another really hot area that we've been talking about. So looking forward to getting to that as well. Before he founded Ossium, Kevin served as the engagement manager at McKinsey's San Francisco office. They are advising a range of clients in the biotech space and healthcare sectors. Prior to that, he was a senior investment associate at Bridgewater Associates. They are doing various quantitative research for that firm. He started off doing his undergraduate degree, interesting in physics and economics at MIT, and then moved on to Harvard to get his law degree. A lot of really cool themes to get into today. We're honored to have with us Kevin Caldwell. Thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show.
Thanks for having me, Ira.
Great having you. Really great. Looking forward to getting into all of these themes today. Really interesting portfolio. But before we touch on any of that, would love to hand the floor to you just for a little bit to talk a little bit more about you. I love looking at stories of folks like yourselves that weren't initially involved in health and biotech at all. You started off in physics, went to law, but seemed to have fallen in love with biotech and healthcare. Tell us a little bit more about your background journey and ultimately what got you to the idea of founding Ossium in the first place.
Yeah, so I grew up in Tennessee. My parents were based out of Nashville. Went to school there, 18 wonderful years. In the summers when I was growing up, I spent a lot of time with my grandparents, and they had a farm in West Tennessee, maybe 90 minutes outside of Nashville. One thing about being out in the country in the summer is that, after nightfall, there's not a lot of things to do. There's nowhere you could, you could drive forever and not get to anything. And so you develop hobbies, interesting ways of keeping sort of your mind active in the evenings. And one thing I noticed, I guess I was probably 11 or 12 years old, you turn the lights off like on the porch outside, and you can just see every star in the sky. It's just this incredible, like the universe in front of you. And so, I got a telescope for my birthday that year, and I got pretty into amateur astronomy, which led to an interest in physics. And I ended up, and I fell in love with it. Just the idea that human beings could write down laws of nature that governed like the universe everywhere and always was just profound to me. And so I ended up going to MIT and to study astrophysics. And so I got so these days, if you follow the sort of science news where the James Webb is discovering new planets like by the week, But this was before all that. Actually, when I was growing up, we'd only just started to discover the first, we called them extrasolar planets. And those are planets outside of our own solar system. It turns out to be incredibly difficult to detect. It's like trying to see sort of a tiny little sort of speck reflecting a tiny fraction of the light from an enormous star very far away. If you're interested in looking at the speck, it takes a lot of it takes a lot of creativity. And so I went to MIT to work with these groups that were basically doing planet hunting, like watching stars for their wobbles to detect the gravitational interaction of them with planets. And I had a blast doing that. After doing that for a bit, I started really thinking about, okay, like what do I want to do? Like who do I want to be? And I realized that I did not want to be a professor. And there are a number of reasons for that, but basically, the place that, I would say physics has been in for the last 40 years or so, or at least the thing that really excited me was the search for a unification theory, like a single framework that could be used to describe all of nature, quantum mechanics to general relativity, very small to very large. That quest not only was going on then, it continues to go on till this day with relatively little progress. And so I decided that I wanted to do something much more tangible, something where I could have sort of a concrete and observable benefit to humanity that I would experience during my lifetime. But I had no idea what that was. I didn't have the slightest clue. And to be honest, at the time, I wasn't even considering life science. I had in my book, biology wasn't real science. Science was physics. Biology was like stamp collecting. And so I was like, okay, well, maybe I want to do something in business. And so I added an economics major because that seemed like relevant enough. And then I actually got pretty into economics. The idea that human behavior at scale operated according to these principles that were measurable was interesting. And it was a truly data-driven, truly empirical area of social science in a way that was interesting. And so I did that. And then, and I guess toward the end of my studies, I cross-registered for constitutional law over at Harvard Law because I thought, why not? It's like not, it's different. It's not physics, it's not econ. I'll maybe learn something interesting. And I ended up loving that. I decided, so I decided to go. So I spent a year, doing some various, just kind of math and physics coding for a bunch of my professors, and I applied to law school, and then I went to Harvard Law, and that also was a phenomenal experience. I probably made many of the closest friends of my life while I was there, and really was really enjoyed kind of learning about kind of the history of the institutions and the practices and the way of thinking that's kind of the bedrock or the underlying rules framework that our sort of modern civilization is based on. At the same time, I interned at a couple of law firms during the summers, and I did not like the actual practice of law at all. And so I finished law school, and I had this degree in physics, and I didn't want to be a lawyer. And I had a degree in physics, I didn't want to be a physicist, and I had a degree in law, and I didn't want to be a lawyer. And so I was like, okay, well, this isn't great. I should probably figure something out. So so then I just started calling, various friends who were in different fields, and just asking the question, like, what do you actually do at your job every day? Do you like it? And do you think I would like it? And I had that conversation with 15 or 20 people. One of them had gone to Bridgewater, a global macro hedge fund, largest in the world at the time. And this was shortly after the financial crisis. So we're talking, you know, 2012, 2013. And in fact, the European sovereign debt crisis was still very much going on. And more or less, Bridgewater had called it. More or less, Bridgewater had avoided the enormous losses that a lot of firms saw during that period. Um, and um, and this idea that you had this group of people that really understood how the global economy worked enough that they were able to anticipate how it would evolve for years at a time through an incredibly sort of tumultuous period that was really fascinating to me, and to be part of that was really interesting. So I went, um, and I learned a ton, had a blast while there. And then, after a couple years, I started reflecting again, and it's like, all right, well, at the end of the day, it's like you taking money from institutions that are very wealthy, you manage that money for them, and then you make them even wealthier. And I thought, okay, is that really what I want to do? And I thought, okay, well, probably not. So I continued this sort of search for like, okay, what would really be meaningful to me? Um, and it's that question, like flipping it from like, what's the most interesting problem I can solve to like, what's the thing that's going to make me proudest? That I've achieved that ultimately led down the path to Ossium.
That's awesome. I enjoy hearing journeys like that. And equally impressive, you start off thinking about the cosmos, the big cosmos, and now you're looking at a different cosmos, one that's
Yeah,
I would say people would think is equally, if not more, complex.
yeah,
As we talk about biology and everything that goes on in bone marrow. And
mhm,
before we get to a lot of what you're doing and sort of the tapping the clinical potential here beyond sort of the
yep,
existing clinical potential, would just love to talk a little bit about the history here, because clearly with bone marrow, we are dealing with the granddaddy, let's say, of the cell therapy
yep,
space, of the hematopoietic stem cell transplantation world. We go back to the late 1930s, where this activity was started. And we don't really think about, what bone marrow is. I mean, it's a really interesting combinatorial mix of hematopoietic stem cells that are involved in everything from the maturation of our blood to these mesenchymal stem cells,
mhm,
which we've learned the last couple of decades can form all sorts of interesting tissues,
mhm.
even into the immune system, and obviously immuno-oncology and CAR T and all that are really hot as well. So, an important basket that leads in many directions. Talk a little bit about how you view bone marrow, and we'll get into what you're doing with it later. But talk a little bit
Great,
about sort of this important basket of biochemical potential, let's say.
great. When people think about cell therapies, they often think of it as a 21st century phenomenon, but you're absolutely right. Our bone marrow transplants have more than 70 years of history behind them. Some of the first transplants were done sort of in the 1950s, and the procedure continued into the 60s and 70s. And as we started to learn more, the first transplants were done before HLA typing was understood, before they realized that you needed to match the
Yep.
donor and the recipient. And with catastrophic results in some of those early transplants. But then there were successful transplants, first between identical twins, and later between unrelated persons, as HLA sort of matching became possible and understood. And stepping back for a minute, um, our blood and immune systems are made, essentially sort of manufactured by the cells of our bone marrow, and in particular by the hematopoietic stem cells, as you described. And they live in these niches in the bone, and they make red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets.
Mhm.
There's lots of other things in the bone marrow. There are the mesenchymal stem cells that you mentioned, which are responsible for making connective tissue. And there's also sort of a gemisch of more differentiated cells and quite a bit of sort of fat in the bone marrow as well. But the sort of for the primary sort of active ingredient, if you will, in the cell therapies that Ossium has in the clinic now are the hematopoietic stem cells. And um, these and so the idea that you could do a transplant of these cells, moving them from one person, infusing them into someone else, reconstituting, which is to say replacing their blood and immune system, is something that has been it's a practice that's been done about 1.5 million times around the
Mhm.
world over the last sort of 70 plus years. And when you do that, right, when you replace the blood and immune system of one person for another, it's a permanent replacement. And so for the rest of the recipient's life, they produce blood and immune cells with the genetics of their bone marrow donor. And that procedure, in principle, can be used to treat almost any disease of the blood or immune system. And in fact, it has been used to treat maybe 75 or 80 different blood and immune diseases in the medical literature over time. By far, the most common use of it is treating leukemias. And I should say that there's really two very different types of bone marrow transplants. There's allogeneic transplants. That's where so that's the donor is one person and the recipient is another person. That word sort of allo means same or similar, and it's a transplant from one person to another. There are then autologous bone marrow transplants, and of course, auto means self, and that's where bone marrow is obtained or recovered from one person, typically frozen. The patient undergoes some radiation and some treatment that's designed to sort of eliminate or typically diminish a malignancy that they have actively, and they're given an infusion of their own cells back. And so, of course, at Ossium, we sort of exclusively work with that first kind of transplant, that allogeneic transplant.
Mhm.
And the most common indication that it's used for is AML. It also, though, it's frequently used for ALL.
Mhm. Mhm.
So bone marrow transplants, just kind of before diving into more of the details of sort of the study and use cases, one thing that's really important to understand is that it's a phenomenally powerful procedure to
Mhm.
permanently replace a blood and immune system. And by and large, historically, the procedure I would say has been underutilized. There's a huge range of different indications that it could be used for that it hasn't been used for. And there's a lot of reasons for that. One of those reasons, one of them is just access to donors, in particular, access to high quality matched donors. And so that is a problem that Ossium set out to solve some years ago with some success to
Mhm.
date. Um, and so that's kind of problem one. How do you take this incredibly powerful, incredibly successful procedure that's used to save, sort of tens of thousands of lives just in the U.S. alone every year, and make it more widely accessible, more available, improve outcomes. And then there's a second thing, which is okay, once you solve this basic problem of supply, once access to the cells themselves is no longer a barrier to doing bone marrow transplants, well, then what could you do? What else could you use the cells for? What other sort of further engineering and manipulation could you do on the cells? What other indications could you use it for that make sense if you've got a stockpile of bone marrow that don't make sense otherwise?
Mhm.
Um, and it's really that second category of application where the possibilities are vast and the potential clinical and health impact is tremendous.
Let's dive into both of those, because I think it's very important to for the audience to understand what you've done on both these fronts, because I think it's kind of important. And specifically on the first, and we talked a little bit a couple weeks ago on the show about organ transplantation, and
Yeah,
just how much, if just by a couple hours, if you could improve
yeah.
the viability of certain organs, how many people we could save just in that period. With what you've done, you've taken a procedure that may take months actually to ultimately get right and set up and extract and store
Right.
the days. And I'd love for you to talk a little bit about sort of that part of the platform first, because I mean, that alone is transformational in its own right. So talk a little bit about sort of the key technologies that allow you to do that part first.
Okay, so I'll begin by describing the way bone marrow transplants are traditionally done, which is to say the way the bone marrow is sourced, and then I can describe sort of the innovations that we've made and the impact of that. So, if you're doing a traditional, allogeneic bone marrow transplant, well, you need to find some donor for the patient. And
Yep.
typically you would start by looking at the family. A sibling has a 25% chance of being a perfect match. In some ways, better than perfect. And what I mean by that is that in addition to the HLA type matching, there are other genetic characteristics that also seem to benefit or reduce the risk of rejection that a sibling will have. And so if you're lucky enough to have a sibling who not only happens to be a perfect match, but is young and healthy enough to be a good donor, you're done. That's great. Most of us aren't that lucky. In particular, most people who need a bone marrow transplant are sort of older and in declining health, and their siblings will very often be of similar age and similar declining health and are not ideal donors, and also only have a 1 in 4 shot of being a perfect one. And so most people need some unrelated donor. And so then you've got to find someone out there in the world you've never met before who is ready, willing, and able to either, if you're doing a traditional bone marrow transplant, have their hip drilled into and their bone marrow aspirated for you, or more commonly today, undergo a mobilization where their stem cells, where drugs cause their stem cells to leave their bone marrow into their peripheral blood, have their blood apheresed, and the stem cells isolated and provided to you in a transfusion. So that is a lot to ask for a perfect stranger. Now, fortunately, every year there's thousands of people who are generous enough and giving enough that they do exactly that, and it's a way that just an ordinary person can save a life. But it's very rare that the first person who's called, who happens to be a match, is able to do that. Often, these sort of global registries work tirelessly, going through what maybe dozens or even hundreds of different people to find someone who's the right match for a patient, and that process takes time. That process can take months. And time, as you alluded to earlier, Ira, is incredibly important here because you've got a patient who, and by the way, I should say, bone marrow transplants are kind of a final line therapy. It's sort of the person has already undergone chemotherapy and radiation, and they've tried lots of things, and they're coming to this decision that they need a bone marrow transplant, and they have an active malignancy, and so time is something that they don't have, and so with every 3 or so days that passes, the patient's odds of still being alive at the end of 5 years go down by about 1%. And so that's the experience of people who succeed at finding a donor, right? Maybe after 2, 3, 4, 5 months of searching, they find someone. That person is tested. That person the transplant is scheduled, and they go forward with it. Now, the challenge is that that works a little bit more than half the time. Maybe 55, 60% of patients who look for an unrelated donor succeed at getting a transplant. And then there are all these patients who search for a donor and who don't get one in time, either because there just weren't that many matching donors in the registry for them, or more commonly, maybe there were some, but by the time they identify someone who is actually able to provide a transplant, their health has deteriorated so much they're no longer strong enough to receive a transplant, and they don't move forward with it. And so what you've got, and so the solution to this, both to the patients who sort of eventually find a transplant after enough time, and even more importantly for those that never do, is to take this whole donor search process, this multi-month long sort of process of searching, scouring the earth for someone who's able to do this, and just do it in advance. Have an actual product that's available, sort of off the shelf to deliver to the person, so that the limiting factor is not, well, when can I get a donor, but okay, when can you get your transplant? Let's get that scheduled. Let's get you ready. And so if you were going to do that, you need to find some way to get lots of a large number and large genetically diversity of hematopoietic stem cells from many donors, sort of processed and just available off the shelf. So how do you do that? Well, people have tried getting people to volunteer in advance and then just sort of freezing the bone marrow for them before. There are groups around the world that have tried that historically, and there's even some groups who try that now. The problem is that people don't love to, get their bone marrow pulled out. It's not fun. And if there's not an actual person who's been identified who's going to die if you don't do that, it's very difficult to persuade someone to just go in and get that done. It's more onerous than giving blood. And statistically, actually, there's a good chance that it never gets used. And right. And so those efforts are usually not that successful. And so what we did at Ossium is we said, okay, well, what can if we need to get the bone marrow, the donors identified, the bone marrow, processed and cryopreserved in advance, we need to find a way to get access to, a good set of donors that's very consistent, that's very scalable. And of course, the answer to that is organ donors. And so the U.S. already has a large and mature deceased organ donor ecosystem.
Yep.
We do, there are 15 to 20,000 deceased organ donors in the United States every year. Each of those donors provides on average 3 to 4 organs that can go to different people, saving more than 50,000 lives every year. It's an incredibly sort of robust, life-saving ecosystem. And so what we've done at Ossium is we sort of have taken that existing organ donation, procurement, transplant world. And on top of it, we've added this sort of new layer that is bone marrow recovery and transplant. We've essentially brought the U.S. organ donation ecosystem, which was initially created to improve and increase the number of solid organ transplants and address the problem of organ failure, into the fight against cancer. And so, I would say organ failure in totality, right? Counting, heart disease, liver disease, et cetera. If that's our leading cause of death in the US, cancers are our second leading cause of death. And leukemia is a very common lethal sort of cancer. And so that effort has resulted in us partnering with more than half of the national organ procurement organizations. So the nonprofits, the same ones that get people to consent to organ donation. Like if you go to the DMV and you check yes on your driver's license, that's because your DMV is working with the local nonprofit organ procurement organization. They're also the groups that get consent from families for organ donation. They do the recoveries. Ossium partners with them.
Mm-hmm.
And by the way, we also partner with the National Marrow Donor Program, which manages the living donor
Okay.
transplant ecosystem and is responsible for enabling the thousands of living donor transplants every year and getting millions of people registered. And so we've taken these two worlds that were separate and we've brought them together. And that has really unlocked this sort of vast potential of the organ donation ecosystem. And so we've built the world's first sort of organ donor derived bone marrow bank.
Awesome. Awesome. And, again, that's an amazing piece of the puzzle, an amazing resource that you have available. You brought technology to play. And then, as you were saying early on, a tremendous amount, obviously, we know about sort of all the hematopoietic, opportunities in terms of leukemias, lymphoma, and so forth. Organ transplant rejection, another hot topic of yours. You set up a couple clinical programs in recent years. One known as Preserve One, which specifically focused on evaluating, what you've created there in terms of the cryopreserved bone marrow banking, and then an expanded access part of that known as Hope. HPC offered a Preserve expansion program for everyone unable to participate in Preserve One.
Right.
Take us through this, because again, this is another awesome example of using what in terms of, all right, we have the resource now. I mean, leukemia, a very important topic still.
Right.
Talk a little bit about Preserve One and Hope.
Great. So our flagship clinical trial, as you pointed out, we call it the Preserve One program. We call it Preserve because we're using cryopreserved bone marrow to preserve human life. And this is a clinical trial that we are running in partnership with the National Marrow Donor Program. And there, as of today, sort of 9 and counting bone marrow transplant centers around the U.S. That are active sites enrolling patients for this study. And we're calling it, as you may guess, it's called Preserve One because, of course, we're also planning a Preserve Two, and I'll speak about that in a minute as well. But this first study is really for that set of patients that I mentioned who don't have a match readily available. So people who don't have a good match in their family, and who don't have a readily accessible, immediately accessible sort of living donor match. And the idea is to enable these people who generally would have very poor outcomes and a very limited sort of a likelihood of long-term survival to get the opportunity to get a life-saving bone marrow transplant. And so that's the first sort of goal. And we measure, our key endpoint there is just engraftment, which is just a way of saying, did the new cells that we gave them from the donor successfully sort of reconstitute their blood and immune system? Did they take hold? And the second goal is really to show just how effective these our source, the sort of bone marrow from organ donors, can be, how safe and effective it can be relative to traditional sources of bone marrow in the hopes of really establishing a new sort of long-term source of these cells that could be used really as a sort of first line source or graft for patients that doesn't require just all of the sort of the tedium of the search for a donor. It doesn't require the family member to make the sacrifice of having their bone marrow aspirated, and really has certain advantages in terms of the transplant can be done immediately. The number of cells that we get from an organ donor is much higher than what you can ethically take from a living volunteer. So, Ira, if you were going to donate bone marrow to someone, you of course still need your stem cells. Your bone marrow is very useful to you,
Sure.
and so if it were to be recovered from you, they would take the minimum amount from you that would still be enough to engraft in the recipient. From an organ donor, it's really the reverse. You want to take as much as you can so that you can save as many lives as possible. And so we're able to do higher dosing of the cells because we are actually directly obtaining the bone marrow from within the bone. We have not only more of the hematopoietic stem cells that are critical for engraftment, but we have less blood, and therefore less of the T cells that are in the peripheral blood, by about 70%. And so that should, and so far, by the way, has reduced the risk of rejection. And then also it's characterized in advance. And so you have an actual product, and the doctor orders a specific dose, a specific number of cells based on their patient's weight that's optimized, which is impossible. A traditional transplant, a bone marrow transplant, is more like logistically, it's like an organ transplant. You recover everything you can from the donor, you ship it overnight to the recipient, and then you infuse everything you get. There's no opportunity to do this robust characterization and dosing. You just take what you can and infuse what you can. And so this is a very different experience for the patient and the doctor. We can make it available within a couple of days if we have a match. And so we ship it to the transplant center before they begin conditioning so that they know that the product is there before they start preparing the patient for the transplant. And we even, we can even have a few additional bags of stem cells available in reserve in case the doctor wants to do sort of an additional dose later as a booster. And so all of these things are designed to really improve the transplantation experience for the patient, make it far more consistent, far more reliable, and we hope far more effective than anything that has been seen before. And so for this study, which we're enrolling patients in now, and by the way, we're going to publish these results later this year. And so I can only say, I won't go into too much detail on the outcomes. What I will say, though, is that, the patients we treated so far, like all of them are doing terrifically, which is to say we've had successful engraftment in 100% of them to date. And none of them have had, and in general, the safety profile that they're seeing is at least as good as what you would see in standard of care, and for some of the patients, much better. And so it's early yet. We're going to keep collecting data. The N is still small now, and we want to get that much higher as we go through PRESERVE 2. But the results are incredibly encouraging. We're excited by them.
No, it sounds extremely exciting, and obviously, it's required to do, go in a certain clinical path. In this case, sort of a reevaluating. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of low hanging fruit here, which is important. And again, the fact that you are opening up the possibilities here, and not just in the different therapeutic states, but the fact that you have the tremendous potential in terms of the portfolio of cells is, just adds really another interesting part to the story. So, obviously making important clinical progress on that front. We'll keep an eye out for the publication this year. The other hot thing on the radar from, a couple of months ago, you guys announced the BARDA contract that you
Right.
secured, and I think this is also very exciting. And I
Yeah.
profiled BARDA, ASPR, the DITRA folks. Everyone's very so the CBRN component of bio or sort of preparedness. We talked a lot about the chemical and bio, the radiological and nuclear, not as much, and it's kind of in 2025, it's kind of scary that we still talk about that, but we got to talk about it.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, these nuclear radiologic incidents, whether they are intentional or accidental or anything in between, they destroy our bone marrow. And
Yeah.
I stood on one of the episodes, a lot of the bone marrow right here in my hips, and that's sort of the main target there. But
Yeah.
talk a little bit about this one, because clearly we need countermeasures, we need preparedness for, God forbid, whatever might happen on this front. Took you a few years to obviously these deals take probably a little longer to put together, but you were
Yeah.
successful. Take us through this, a little bit of the background story here and what you achieved with this deal.
Yeah. So, in the early 2000s, 2004, 2005, Congress passed the Project BioShield Act.
Mm-hmm.
And this was in the wake not only of 9/11, but also of sort of the anthrax scare.
Yep.
And there was a lot of thinking about, well, okay, how prepared are we just as a nation for sort of large scale sort of mass casualty events, whether it be through war, through terrorism, even accidents at nuclear reactors, et cetera. And Congress really set up a framework and kind of a permanent set of organizations within HHS, the Department of Health and Human Services, with a couple of aims. One, to accelerate the development of technologies that would improve our ability to respond to these disasters. And two, that would then actually build or maintain the resources necessary to actually do the response, to manage the logistics of it. And so there's a few different categories of this. There's sort of infectious disease and sort of biological threats, and and so the COVID vaccine that Moderna made was backed by BARDA,
Yep.
for example, and that significantly contributed to their ability to rapidly develop and launch a vaccine that helped to end the pandemic. They also have a chemical weapons division.
Mm-hmm.
And then finally, of course, there's the nuclear and radiological countermeasures division of BARDA. And that's the group that we're working with now at Ossium. And, one of the scenarios that they're charged with preparing us for is, sort of a catastrophic scenario where one or perhaps multiple nuclear weapons detonates on U.S. soil. And as sort of horrific as this concept is, of course, part of the job of our government and of the team at BARDA is to sort of envision that scenario and ensure. And if DoD is charged with minimizing the odds that ever happens at all, part of what HHS is doing here is ensuring that if it does happen, we're ready to respond. And so that and so they're in a scenario where one of these weapons goes off. Of course, you'd have many people who were close enough to ground zero that they die in the initial blast, but you have far more people who would be exposed to enough radiation that they could eventually lose their lives, but not exposed, but not close enough to ground zero that they're killed immediately. And so here you could have anywhere from tens or hundreds of thousands of people who are exposed to enough radiation that they get what's called acute radiation syndrome. And there's
Mm-hmm.
different levels of ARS depending on the amount of exposure that you get in different types of it. But one type of ARS that would be most common is called hematopoietic acute radiation syndrome, or HARS. And that essentially means that these stem cells we've been talking about, these hematopoietic stem cells in the bone marrow, mutate. So this is bad, and it can result in death typically within a few weeks. And so what you need to do then is to find a way to replace these cells, which, as we said before, make your red blood cells, your white blood cells, and your platelets. We need to find a way to replace these cells rapidly so that the person can then produce healthy blood for the rest of their lives. Well, that's of course exactly what you have to do when you do a bone marrow transplant.
Hmm.
In the case of a bone marrow transplant, the patient has a malignancy. In this case, the person has mutations from radiation. But actually, the treatment is essentially the same, and even the problems themselves have some similarity in them. And so you the challenge though, right, is one of scale, because we mentioned earlier that we do maybe 10,000 or so allogeneic bone marrow transplants every year in the United States. Well, here you might need to do 5 or 10 times as many transplants as that in just a few weeks. It would overwhelm our ecosystem. The logistics for that are not in place.
Hmm.
And one of the problems would be finding donors. Now, I mentioned that it takes, 2, 3, 4, 5 months to find an unrelated donor, even in normal situations. Well, by then everyone is dead. You don't have time to do that. You've got to have the cells available in advance if you're going to provide transplants here. What you need is a prepared strategic stockpile of bone marrow that you can deploy on demand according to a predetermined plan for this exact scenario. And so if you're going to do that, you need to begin by showing that it's possible to bank bone marrow and deploy it, and that you can get sort of good clinical outcomes for it. And then once you've shown that, you need to scale it. And so um, Ossium has won a sort of development contract from BARDA, and that basically means that the government is sort of supporting us in demonstrating that the technology that we've built, our entire bone marrow, processing, cryopreservation, and deployment sort of platform, that it's capable of being used effectively in the clinic. And so that and so that you may wonder, okay, but how do you do that, right? Because we don't actually have, nuclear weapons going off routinely. There aren't people walking around with hematopoietic acute radiation syndrome. It turns out that for these kinds of, this is a very common problem in medical countermeasures because, there are often you're trying to prepare for something that could happen in the future, but that doesn't happen routinely every day. And so you identify some disease that does happen routinely that's a reasonable proxy for the one that you want to treat. And in this case, sort of leukemia and the patient's experience under leukemia, especially given that we often use radiation to actually help to treat them before doing the bone marrow transplant and to condition them, it turns out to be a pretty good proxy for acute radiation syndrome. And so the PRESERVE study that we mentioned earlier, we're doing with the support of the US government, both right now to meet the unmet need that we have for blood cancer treatment for these patients and to prepare for a future event that we hope will never occur, where that same bone marrow, where we're called upon to respond in the event of a nuclear or radiological disaster.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, when I was talking to David Boucher, talking about the strategic national stockpile, yeah, thinking about what you have though, and being able to sort of plug into that, and no, that's it. It's exciting. It's a very exciting sort of component of all this. Kevin, and to the extent you could talk about it, because I know it's a little earlier stage, but you do have some work going on, as I mentioned early on, in sort of organ transplant rejection, in sort of this multivisceral transplantation category.
Yes.
And here, right, it's not about, okay, I'm a leukemia patient that is going to have my bone marrow ablated and replaced. Here, you're looking to really teach the immune system, and
Right.
again, you could talk about this chimerism. It went a little over my head, but nonetheless, organ transplantation, very important. We know millions of people on lists waiting for each and every type of organ
Right.
possible. Talk a little bit about some, because this also seems like a transformational aspect of what you have available to you. And if you can just say a few words about it, you got some phase 1 stuff going on as well,
Right.
but whatever you can talk about.
Okay. So, I mentioned earlier that when we do a bone marrow recovery from an organ donor, just the number of cells that we get is much larger. And yes, one use of that is just being able to give a better dose to the blood cancer patient. But
Yep.
it also means that you might just have enough cells that you could do multiple transplants, or more broadly, that you could save the life of a blood cancer patient and still have plenty of bone marrow available
Yeah.
to save the life of another patient and do something else. It turns out that is robustly true. That for most of our donors, we have enough yield that we really can save multiple lives with it. And at Ossium, we really think it's incumbent on us to continuously push for new ways to improve human health. Like our
Yep.
basic mission is to improve human health through bioengineering. And so we step back and we think about, okay, like what are major problems that we can solve using the platform, sort of the bone marrow bank that we have, and one of if you look at it, if you just look at sort of causes of death in the United States, number one is you've got heart disease at number one, and then you've got cancers at number two, and then you've got these various dementias and things. But if you go and you look at it more systematically, there's a lot of death results from organ failure of various
Yep.
kinds, and one of the final line treatments, of course, for certain organ failures is an organ transplant. And I think most people know, most of your listeners probably know that there's a shortage of organs available for transplant,
Yep.
and a lengthy wait list. And so that's a problem that some various people are trying to solve in different ways by trying to make organs, by trying to grow sort of human organs in labs, and even trying to grow humanized organs in sort of in animals and things. Um, so there's another part of the problem, though. The problem isn't just the number of organs that are available. There's also a problem where even the organs that are available, the ones that we succeed at transplanting, right? Um, One thing that some of your users might not know is that despite the immunosuppression that organ recipients take after the transplant, most of those organs are still rejected eventually. The immunosuppression will delay that rejection from, immediate to, up to maybe 10 years if it's an unrelated donor, and longer if it's a related donor, but they are eventually rejected. And so when that happens, often, maybe the patient dies, or they go back on the wait list and they need another organ from another donor. And so if you could find a way to prevent that, to make the organ transplant a permanent cure for the organ failure, rather than sort of a temporary treatment that just results in the person needing organ again later, well, that's profound, right? That's a lever that we can pull to really significantly increase the number of organs that are available for transplant. And then two, when you're on immunosuppression, the person for the rest of their life, they have an elevated risk of infection, elevated risk of cancer. It significantly reduces their quality of life to be on these drugs. And so, part of our framework at Ossium is that we really believe in curative therapies. We want you to give you a treatment that will profoundly change and improve your biology for the rest of your life in a way that makes you disease free, or gets you as close to that as possible. And having to take a cocktail of immunosuppressant drugs in perpetuity is not that. And so what and so here, to go to your question, right, about how exactly we plan to this and what Ossium is doing. So I mentioned earlier that when we do a bone marrow transplant, we're permanently replacing the blood and immune system of the recipient for that of the donor. And so there is this problem that happens in organ transplantation that I think most people are familiar with, where you get this new organ and your native immune system rejects it, right? Your immune system attacks this foreign organ, and it sort of makes sense. Transplantation doesn't occur in nature. That's something that humans innovated, and so because of that, the immune system quite, sort of correctly doesn't understand the presence of this foreign organ, and so um, the interesting thing is that if you give the donor an infusion of bone marrow from the same, sorry, if you give the recipient, the patient, an infusion of bone marrow from the
Mhm.
same donor they got the organ from, and this part
Yep.
is key, the organ and bone marrow donor are the same person, then they're not just getting the new kidney, for example, from the donor, they're also getting an infusion of the donor's immune system, an immune system that recognizes that organ as self and is protective of that organ. And so what we find is that we can induce a state called chimerism, hematopoietic
Right.
mixed chimerism,
Okay.
where the patient is producing blood and immune cells from both their native bone marrow and their organ donors' bone marrow at the same time. So if you were to get a sample of their blood and test it, you would actually see two distinct genetic signatures because they're in this chimeric state. And we basically achieve this by doing a kind of partial bone marrow transplant where we do give them an infusion of cells from the organ donor, but we don't totally ablate or annihilate their native immune system because there's nothing wrong with their immune system other than that it doesn't agree with this new organ. They don't have a malignancy. And so if you do this properly, right, if you then you can get sort of durable chimerism and more importantly durable tolerance of the organ. So
Mhm.
that means the person can be weaned off of immunosuppression and
Yep.
and live a more normal life with this new organ without needing the immunosuppression that causes them to get elevated infection risk, and we hope um, without without rejecting the organ after 5 or 10 years. And so
Mm.
this could profoundly change organ transplantation. Now, now I should say that the science behind this dates back to at least the 1980s when there were animal studies in which solid organs in first small animal and then non-human primate models were transplanted with bone marrow and sort of evidence of tolerance was seen. And there's a number of groups and companies that have worked on this, mostly in kidney transplants over the years. Um, at at Ossium, we're sort of in a very unique and sort of intentional position where we just have vast amounts of bone marrow from organ donors, all of whom sort of definitionally provided organs to multiple people after their death, and all those organ recipients are potentially people who could receive bone marrow infusions from their organ donors and live without immunosuppression. And so
Mhm.
this is an area where we've done some promising preclinical work. We've even done a transplant in a multivisceral model. We've gotten really positive initial signals from that, and we'll do more on that sort of later after our blood cancer sort of program is more sort of closer to commercialization. But we're really excited about the potential clinical impact on organ transplantation. And more broadly, just the vision here is we want to move toward a world where, failure of a single part of the body, failure of a single organ, or even failure of the immune system need not be a death sentence. It should be
Yeah.
possible to be able to develop really reliable, scalable, sustainable, effective methods of simply replacing, rejuvenating, renewing, sort of vital parts of the body, whether it's a solid organ or a blood and immune system, in ways that allows the person to carry on with not just with living, but with living with vigor and with hope. And so that is fundamentally what Ossium is about, and we're excited about expanding that.
Yeah, I mean, it's again, when you think about those sort of what I'll call the weakest links, we the heart disease, the cancer, and then ultimately, that you, I don't like refer to it as repurposing, but in a sense, going back to what we
Yeah.
chatted about at the beginning, that here we are with the 1930s technology that we're really doing a great job at rediscovering the potential of what can be done with it once you have the ability to make a lot of it at scale, which you
Right.
also succeeded at. So I'm very excited about this story and excited for what comes next. Kevin, while we have you, anything else on the radar for 2025 that we should know about? I mean, I went into PubMed and I know you got a bunch of your scientific folks doing earlier stage stuff all over the place, but
Yeah.
anything else that you want to mention while you have you today? Clearly, you got a lot already on your plate, but anything I missed while we're here with you today?
Well, let's see. So I would say for anyone who's, if there's a physician listening who's intrigued by this and, does sort of bone marrow transplants or has patients who need transplants, I would encourage them just to go to our website, go to the Hope page, this program that we've started that allows us to provide. It's an expanded access program to preserve that
Mhm.
allows us to provide bone marrow to patients who need a transplant, but who just aren't at one of the participating centers or for whatever reason can't enroll in the clinical trial directly. We think it's tragic it is tragic anytime someone is dying from a curable disease, in particular if there's a treatable, if we have bone marrow that can potentially treat them. And so I'd encourage them to do that. I think there are a couple of conferences, including the American Society for Hematology or ASH conference in December that we'll be at,
Mhm.
that I'd encourage anyone. You don't have to wait until December to reach out, but if you happen to be there, we'll be at that conference and we'd be happy to talk to anyone there. And then, I should say that we do have a couple of other programs that are worth mentioning. And so, the primary complication of bone marrow transplants, like when the major safety risk that patients face, is called graft versus host disease,
Sure.
where the new immune system attacks the rest of the body. Which, by the way, it's kind of the mirror image of organ rejection, which is host versus graft
Yeah.
disease, where the old immune system attacks the new organ. And
Mhm.
so we do have a GVHD sort of program that right now is preclinical, but we have received a go-ahead from the FDA to
Nice.
start a clinical trial based on the strength of the preclinical data that we have there. And so we'll be doing, there's we've made some significant innovations to the I don't want to say too much here because there are some patents that are pending, and
Understood.
I also want to acknowledge my sort of co-founder and chief science officer, sort of Eric Woods, who's been working sort of tirelessly on these innovations for years now. But we're really excited about our ability to make bone marrow transplants safer and about showing our ability to make all bone marrow transplants safer in the clinic. And this GVHD study is really going to be the path through which we do that. And we've mentioned a few times that maybe we do 10,000 bone marrow transplants, and maybe there's 20,000 people who look for them. But the truth is that there's over 100,000 people in the U.S. every year diagnosed with the disease that could be treated with a bone marrow transplant. We just don't attempt to do transplants for most of them because the procedure is fairly dangerous. We think we can fix that. We think we can make it dramatically safer uh, by minimizing the risk of graft versus host disease, and that's really going to have a profound impact on human health. And so, stay tuned for more on that.
Excellent. Excellent. Yeah. Exciting 2025 coming up, and I look forward to continue to follow the story, Kevin. It's really an awesome team and structure you put together there to get this done, and I'm rooting you on, and really great. Again, for everybody that's going to be listening to this episode of our show across the various podcast networks, or who will be watching on the YouTube channel. You've been spending time with Kevin Caldwell, Chief Executive Officer, Co-founder, and President, Ossium Health, doing really amazing things with bioengineering to enhance human health, to develop these novel cellular therapeutic opportunities. Kevin, again, I want to thank you for taking the time out of your schedule to talk for a little while today about what you're up to. Thank you for everything you're doing. And as we like to say on our show, thanks for create a better tomorrow for literally millions of patients out there that this is applicable to. Really an awesome story.
Well, thanks for having me, Aaron.
Great having you.